My own son locked me out of the house. I raised him in and told me it belonged to him now, but I had no idea what he was about to regret next. The lock beeped red 3 times before I understood what was happening. Not broken, changed. My own front door didn't recognize me anymore. I stood frozen on the porch, a grocery bag cutting into my fingers, milk sweating through the plastic. My heart pills rattled loose inside that bag because I'd left the pill organizer on the kitchen counter that morning. 38 years I'd lived behind that door. Now it wouldn't open for me. My phone buzzed. Owen, my son. Mom, he said, flat as a stranger reading a script. The house is mine now. You need to go. I laughed. I actually laughed because it sounded like a joke my own child would never tell me. He wasn't joking. Sienna already picked out new furniture, he said. It's happening, Mom. Don't make this ugly. I stood on the sidewalk of 41 on 18 Brookhaven Court, the house I'd raised him in, holding groceries like a woman with nowhere left to go. Then I heard tires on the driveway. Warren, my husband. He took one look at my face, at the bag shaking in my hand, and something in him went very still. Warren doesn't rattle easily. 41 years married to that man. I've seen him rattle maybe 4 times. What happened? He said. Not a question. A demand. Owen changed the locks, I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. He told me to leave. Warren didn't yell. He didn't even blink. Then tonight, he said, he learns who actually owns this family. We got in through the side door off the mudroom. The one Owen apparently forgot still had a spare key hidden in the shed, tucked behind the paint can since 1994. Owen and Sienna were already inside, measuring the living room wall with a tape measure like it was already theirs to redecorate. Dad, we need to talk, Owen said, turning around fast, like we'd caught him at something. We had. No, Warren said. Tonight you listen. Sienna crossed her arms over her chest. This is getting uncomfortable, Warren. We're just being practical here. Locking my wife out of her own home, I said. That was practical? Mom was emotional, Owen said, like I was a liability to be managed. Like I wasn't a person standing 3 feet away from him. That word hit harder than the locked door had. Emotional. Like I'd been hysterical instead of simply homeless. On my own front lawn, on a Tuesday afternoon. Warren looked at our son for a long moment. I watched something behind his eyes close like a door. You didn't build one thing in this house, he said. Not the walls. Not the business that pays for the walls. Not the life you think you're already owed. Everything happens on my terms now, not yours. He pulled out his phone and called our lawyer, right there on speaker. No hesitation. Harold, open the trust tonight. Everything in it. Reviewed before sunrise. Owen's voice cracked. Dad? Do what? Nobody answered him. That was only the beginning. I didn't know yet how deep this went or how long Owen had been building toward that moment. It would take weeks to understand the whole shape of what my son had done. But that night, standing in my own living room like a trespasser, I understood one thing clearly. He hadn't done this on impulse. Nobody plans to change a lock that fast, that cleanly, unless they've been planning it for a while. I'm 61 years old. I've been Warren Hargrove's wife for 41 of those years, married in a small Methodist church in Kettering, Ohio, on a humid June afternoon in 1985, back when he was 23 and driving a truck for a heating and cooling outfit that would eventually become his own company. We bought the house at 41 on 18 Brookhaven Court in the spring of 1988, 3 years into the marriage, back when I was pregnant with Owen, and Warren was mixing his savings account with 2 small loans from his father to make a 12% down payment. It cost us $94,000. It felt like a fortune. We painted the nursery yellow because we didn't know yet if Owen would be a boy or a girl, and we ate spaghetti on the floor for the first month because we couldn't afford a kitchen table. Owen was born in October of that year. Paige, our daughter, came 4 years later. I raised both of them mostly at home while Warren built Hargrove Mechanical Systems, from a 2-truck operation into a company that, by last year, cleared $7.2 million doing commercial HVAC contracts across 3 counties, 42 employees, a fleet of 18 trucks, a name that meant something on job sites from Dayton to Springfield. Those first years in the house were leaner than anyone would guess, looking at what Hargrove Mechanical eventually became. Warren worked 12-hour days running service calls himself, underbidding competitors just to get his name in front of building managers, coming home smelling like flux and sweat, too tired most nights to do more than eat and fall asleep in his chair. I worked the phones and the books from our kitchen table until Owen started school, then took a part-time job at a dentist's office on Far Hills Avenue to help cover the lean years while the company found its footing. Nobody in this family was handed anything. I want that on the record because it matters to how the rest of this went. Owen grew up watching that build happen. I think that's part of what happened to him, if I'm honest with myself. He watched his father go from nothing to something, and somewhere along the way, he decided that inheritance was owed to him faster than it was being delivered. Paige was a different kind of child almost from the start. Where Owen wanted the answer handed to him, Paige wanted to work the problem out herself, even if it took her 3 times as long and ended in tears halfway through. She got a paper route at 12 to save for a bicycle Warren had offered to simply buy her outright. She said no. She wanted to earn it, and 6 months later she did, counting crumpled dollar bills out on the kitchen table like it was the most important transaction of her life. I used to worry, if anything, that Paige worked too hard for things that should have come easier. I never once worried that about Owen. I worried about the opposite, and I never quite admitted that to myself until much later. He wasn't a bad kid. I want to say that clearly, because it matters to how this story ends. He was charming, quick, good with people the way his father was good with people. He played baseball at at Fairmont High. He got decent grades without trying particularly hard. He had a habit, even young, of believing rules were suggestions that applied to other people. There was an earlier moment, smaller than anything that came later, that I think about more now than I used to. Owen was 17. He took Warren's truck one Friday night without asking, out past his curfew, and clipped a guardrail on Whip Road coming home too fast. When we asked what happened, he told us calmly that a friend had been driving. He held to that story for 2 full days, right up until the friend's mother called ours, confused, asking why Owen was telling people her son had wrecked a truck he'd never once been in that night. Owen apologized when he got caught. He always apologized when he got caught. What unsettled me even then wasn't the guardrail. 17-year-olds clip guardrails. It was how easily the story came to him, how steady his voice stayed while he built it, like the lying cost him nothing at all. I remember the first time that same habit cost real money. Owen was 26. He came to Warren with an idea for a side business, an HVAC parts distribution operation he wanted to call Buckeye Comfort Supply, selling compressors and coils to smaller contractors who couldn't get manufacturer pricing on their own. It wasn't a bad idea. Warren even liked it. Owen needed a guarantor for a $40,000 business loan to get inventory moving. He brought Warren a stack of papers one Sunday afternoon in March of 2022 and said it was basically a formality, that the bank just wanted a family name attached, that he'd have it paid off within a year. Warren signed it without reading every page. That was his mistake, and he'd admit it later, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Buckeye Comfort Supply lasted 14 months. It folded in the spring of 2023, buried under supplier debt and a lease Owen couldn't get out of. The $40,000 guarantor loan came due, and because Owen had no way to pay it, Warren paid it himself, quietly. He didn't tell me the real reason for almost 8 months. He told me it was a business expense and let me believe it was something to do with a supplier dispute at Hargrove Mechanical. I found out the truth by accident, going through a folder of old bank statements. When I asked him about it, Warren just shook his head and said, "He's our son." What was I supposed to do? Let it ruin his credit at 27? That was Warren's answer for almost everything with Owen. What was I supposed to do? There was a second incident, smaller but more telling in hindsight. In 2019, Owen had been working at Hargrove Mechanical for 3 years by then, moving up through project management. He was assigned to bid a commercial contract for Whitfield Aerospace, a $1.4 million retrofit job at their Dayton facility. Owen underbid it by $180,000 without running the numbers past Warren or the estimating team, because he wanted to win the contract personally and prove he could close a deal that size on his own. He won it. Hargrove Mechanical lost roughly $180,000 completing a job it should have turned a profit on, because the labor and material costs Owen quoted didn't match reality. Warren covered the loss out of the company's reserve fund and had an uncomfortable conversation with Owen about authority and process. Owen apologized. He also, I noticed, never really believed he'd done anything wrong. He believed he'd taken initiative and gotten unlucky on the numbers. That mattered later, in 2023, when Warren needed to promote someone into the newly created VP of Operations role at Hargrove Mechanical. Owen assumed the job was his. He'd been there 7 years by then. He had the family name, but Warren gave the position to Marcus Ibarra instead, a man who'd been with the company 15 years and had never once needed a loss covered quietly or a bid corrected after the fact. Owen didn't take it well. He didn't quit, but something in him changed after that. He started talking more about what he was owed, in vague terms at first, over holiday dinners, in the kind of comments you can convince yourself are jokes if you want to. Then he met Sienna. Sienna Marsh came from a family that talked about property values the way other families talk about the weather. Her mother, Diane, sold real estate in the northern suburbs and had opinions about square footage that she shared unprompted at length at every gathering I ever hosted. Sienna and Owen married in October of 2023, a lovely wedding at a vineyard outside Yellow Springs that cost, by my estimate, close to $60,000, a good portion of which Warren and I quietly covered. I liked Sienna at first. She was polished, ambitious, good at conversation. It took almost a year for me to notice the pattern underneath the polish. Every visit to our house came with an offhand comment about how much space we had for just the two of us. Every conversation about the future circled back, gently, persistently, to what would happen to the house eventually. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself a lot of things that year. That turned out not to be true. Thanksgiving of 2024 was the first time I said something out loud, instead of just noticing it privately. Diane had come with Sienna and Owen, uninvited but not unwelcome, the way she often did by then. And somewhere between the turkey and the pie, she started talking at length about a colleague of hers whose in-laws had done the smart thing and transferred their house to their children years before either parent passed, avoiding probate, avoiding taxes, avoiding what she called a mess. She wasn't subtle about who the story was for. She looked at me twice while she told it. "That's a conversation for estate lawyers, not turkey dinners," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I'm just saying it's smart planning," Diane said. Nothing more than that. Owen didn't defend me. He didn't agree with her either. He just ate his pie and let the silence after my comment sit there a beat too long before changing the subject himself. And I remember thinking, even then, that his silence felt like a kind of answer. I didn't know yet what question it was answering. By January of 2025, Warren's health had become a factor none of us could ignore. He collapsed at a job site outside Beaver Creek, chest pain that turned out to be a 90% blockage in his left anterior descending artery. They put in a stent at Miami Valley Hospital on a Thursday morning. He was 63 years old and had never spent a night in a hospital before that week. Owen visited him in recovery. He held his father's hand and cried real tears, and I believed in that moment that whatever else had shifted between us, my son still loved his father. I still believe that, actually. That's the part I've had the hardest time making peace with. I don't think Owen ever stopped loving us. I think he just decided, somewhere along the way, that love and entitlement were the same thing, and that taking what he thought he'd eventually inherit anyway wasn't really theft. It was just moving up a timeline he'd already written for himself in his head. That belief is what set the next 4 months in motion, and I didn't see it coming, not clearly, until it was already sitting in a kitchen drawer under a stack of expired coupons. The Sunday dinner where it started was nothing unusual on its surface. March 9th, 2025, 6 weeks after Warren's stent. I'd made pot roast. Owen and Sienna came over like they did most Sundays, and for the first hour it was ordinary, easy, the kind of family dinner I used to take completely for granted. Then Owen set his fork down and said, "Mom, Dad, can we talk about something practical?" Warren looked up. "Practical how?" "This house is a lot for 2 people," Owen said. 4 bedrooms, that whole basement, the yard. Especially now, Dad, with your heart. Have you thought about downsizing? Something smaller, easier to manage? It sounded reasonable. That's what made it work. If he'd walked in demanding the house that first night, I would have laughed him out of the room. Instead, he built a case, one gentle stone at a time, and every stone on its own looked like concern. "We're not ready to think about that," I said. "Your father's doing fine." "I'm just saying it's worth thinking about," Owen said, "before it becomes an emergency instead of a plan." Warren changed the subject. I let it go. That was the first ceiling, and it felt manageable because it was just a conversation. 2 weeks later, it stopped being just a conversation. Owen came by on a Tuesday evening in late March alone, which was unusual enough that I noticed it before he said a word. He sat at the kitchen table and turned his coffee mug in slow circles before he spoke. "I've been thinking about what happens if something happens to you, Dad," he said. "Not to be morbid, but you had a 90% blockage. That's not nothing. What if the next one doesn't come with a warning? Then your mother inherits everything, same as it's always been set up," Warren said. "You know that, Owen." "I know how it's set up now," Owen said. "I'm asking if it should stay that way. I don't want us fighting over a house later, after you're gone, when everyone's grieving and emotional. I'd rather we sort it out now while you're still here to make the call yourself." He said it gently. He said it like a son who loved his father and feared losing him. I believed that part was real, but underneath the gentleness was a demand dressed up as foresight, and I felt it land somewhere cold in my chest even as I told myself I was being unfair to him. "We'll talk to Harold about updating things eventually," Warren said. "Not tonight." "Sure," Owen said. "Eventually." He said the word like it tasted bad. That was the second ceiling. It held for about 3 weeks, and then it didn't. Sienna and her mother started coming by more often in April, always with a reason. Diane wanted to see how the tulips along the front walk were doing, since she'd helped me plant half of them years earlier. Sienna wanted to borrow a serving dish for a dinner party. Small, plausible visits, except they kept ending the same way, with the 2 of them standing in my living room talking about square footage and natural light like I wasn't in the room. On April 12th, Diane pulled a fabric swatch out of her purse, unprompted, and held it up against my curtains. "This would be gorgeous in here," she said. "Warmer than what you've got now." "Diane, this is my living room," I said, as evenly as I could manage. "For now," she said, and smiled like she'd made a joke, and I couldn't tell if she meant it as one. I told Owen about it that weekend. I said it plainly. "It's making me uncomfortable, having your wife and her mother measure my house like it's already for sale." "You're reading into things, Mom," he said. "We're just excited about the future. That's not a crime." I didn't say it was a crime. I said it made me uncomfortable. "Everything makes you uncomfortable lately," Owen said. "Maybe that's something to think about too." That was the third ceiling, and it broke cleanest of all, because instead of addressing what I'd said, he turned it back on me, made my discomfort the problem instead of his behavior. I didn't have a name for that tactic then. I do now. Detective Grady used the word manipulation so many times over the following months that it stopped sounding dramatic and started sounding like an accounting term, a line item, a category of behavior with a clear definition. The fourth stone came from a direction I hadn't expected. Owen called Paige. I only found out about the call weeks later, when Paige finally told me herself, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she never drank. Owen had called her in mid-April, casual at first, catching up, then steering the conversation toward the house. He told her Mom and Dad were struggling to keep up with it. He told her it might be easier on everyone if Paige backed him publicly, in front of Warren, on the idea of an early transfer, framing it as looking out for our well-being rather than his own interest. "He wanted me to tell you and Dad that I agreed it was time to downsize," Paige said. "He said it would carry more weight coming from both of us instead of just him." I told him no. I told him I thought it was a strange thing to be pushing this hard, this fast, and he got quiet and changed the subject. She hadn't told me right away because she didn't want to start a fight between siblings over what still felt, to her at the time, like an overzealous but harmless push. I understood that hesitation. I'd had the same one myself for weeks, trading away my own discomfort for the hope that I was simply misreading my son. But Paige's refusal mattered more than she knew at the time. It meant Owen couldn't say, later, that the whole family had wanted this. It meant one person had said no clearly, on the record, before any of the rest of us understood there there was a record being built at all. The fifth ceiling, and the one that broke everything wide open, came in the last week of April, while Warren was 300 miles away in Indianapolis for 4 days at an HVAC distributors conference. The kind of trip he took every spring, planned a year in advance. Nothing unusual about it at all. Owen came by on the second night alone, carrying a manila folder. He set it on the kitchen table like it was nothing, like he brought paperwork to my kitchen table every week. Harold mentioned we should get some of the trust paperwork updated, he said. Since Dad's not around this week, I figured I'd bring it by so you could sign now and we wouldn't have to wait. It's just a formality, Mom. Standard stuff. What kind of paperwork? I asked. Beneficiary designations, county recording stuff. It's boring, honestly. He slid the folder toward me and clicked a pen open, held it out. Harold said it's time sensitive, something about a filing window. I want to be honest about this part, because it's the part that still makes my stomach turn. I almost signed it. My pen was an inch from the paper. Something in me, some old instinct, made me stop. I'd rather Harold walk me through it himself, I said, or wait for your father. Owen's face changed for just a second, a flicker I'd never seen on him before, gone almost as fast as it came. Then he smiled again, easy, warm. Why do you have to make everything so difficult, Mom? It's paperwork. I'm trying to help. I'm sure you are, I said. I'd still rather wait. He put the folder back in his bag a little too quickly. Sienna's cousin Derek can walk us through the county side of things, if you don't want to bother Harold with something this small, he said, almost as an afterthought, already standing, already halfway to the door. He does title work, saves everybody the billable hours. I didn't think much of that sentence at the time. It was one line in an evening full of lines, and I was more focused on the folder than on who Derek was, or what title work had to do with beneficiary paperwork. I filed it away without meaning to, the way you file away a strange smell in a house you're about to leave, not understanding yet that you'll need to remember it later. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I told Warren about the folder the night he got home from Indianapolis, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where Owen had held that pen out to me 2 nights earlier. Warren went quiet for a long time, turning his coffee cup in slow circles the same way Owen had turned his weeks before, a gesture I noticed only because I'd already learned to notice it. You didn't sign anything, Warren said. It wasn't quite a question. I didn't sign anything, I said. I wanted to. For about 10 seconds, standing right here, I wanted to just sign it and stop being the person making everything difficult. Then I thought about how strange it was that he needed it done that week, while you were out of town, instead of waiting 4 more days for you to be home. Good, Warren said. Trust that. Whatever that feeling was, trust it. He wanted to call Owen that night and ask him directly what the paperwork had actually been. I asked him to wait, to let me watch a little longer first, to see if the pattern repeated itself before we accused our son of something we couldn't yet prove. Looking back, I've wondered if waiting cost us anything. Harold has told me more than once that it didn't, that the trust restructuring would have gone the same way regardless of 3 or 4 extra weeks. I believe him. Some nights I still wonder anyway. 3 weeks passed. Life went back to something that looked ordinary from the outside, dinners and phone calls and Sunday visits, except I found myself watching Owen differently now, cataloging small things I used to let pass without notice. Then came the Tuesday I've already told you about, groceries in my hand, a lock that didn't know me anymore, my son's voice on the phone, flat as a stranger's, telling me the house was his and I needed to go. I didn't understand yet how long he'd been building toward that moment, or how many people had helped him build it. That understanding came in pieces over the following weeks, and each piece made the last 4 months look different than I'd understood them at the time. The morning after the lockout, once we were back inside and Owen and Sienna had gone, Warren didn't let them stay in the house that night, not after what happened. Harold Voss called before 8. Warren, he said, I need to tell you something I found, and I need you to stay calm while I do it. 4 months earlier, in January, someone had pulled a title search on the Brookhaven Court property. Harold had access to the county recorder's alerts because he'd set up monitoring on the house years earlier, a habit left over from a property dispute Warren had with a neighbor in the 90s. The search had been requested under Owen's name. 4 months, Warren repeated, like the number itself was the crime. Before any of this, before the locks, before any of it, I felt something in my chest go tight and cold. 4 months meant this wasn't a decision Owen had made in a moment of desperation or entitlement after a bad week. 4 months meant a plan. That same morning, our bookkeeper Carla called, and I could hear the panic in her voice before she finished her first sentence. Someone tried to pull 3 years of company financials yesterday afternoon, she said. They used Owen's login credentials and told our accounting software vendor that Warren had authorized full access. Warren, I called your cell to confirm before I released anything and you didn't answer, so I held it. I need you to tell me this was actually you. It wasn't. Warren hadn't authorized anything. Someone, using Owen's access, had tried to pull financial records covering Hargrove Mechanical's full valuation, the kind of documents you'd need if you were trying to establish what a business was worth for a loan application, or a settlement, or a claim on assets you believed you were entitled to. I found the third piece myself, later that same day, looking for a coupon in the kitchen junk drawer, the one with rubber bands and old batteries and takeout menus nobody ever used. Underneath a stack of expired grocery coupons was a folded document, a blank quitclaim deed for 41-18 Brookhaven Court. Owen and Sienna's names were already typed into to the grantee section. Only the signature lines were empty. Mine, Warren's, waiting. My hands shook so badly I dropped it twice on the kitchen floor before I managed to dial Warren's number. He came home and stood over that paper for a long time without saying anything. "He's not confused," Warren finally said. "He's building something, and every step has been aimed at one thing, getting our names off this house and his name onto it." We brought in a forensic accountant the following week, a sharp, quiet woman named Renata Boyle, who Harold had used on 2 prior business disputes. She spent 19 days going through everything: the title search, the attempted financial pull, bank records, the folder Owen had brought to my kitchen table in April, which I'd photographed with my phone before he could take it away that night. A small act of self-protection I hadn't fully understood I was performing at the time. Renata called us into Harold's conference room on a Thursday in June. She slid a folder across the table, thicker than the one Owen had brought me. "Someone submitted a home equity loan application against this property to Meridian Trust Bank," she said. $10,000 requested. The application includes signature pages for both of you. Neither signature is authentic. I've compared them against verified samples. The forgeries are competent but not professional." She kept going. "The income figures on the application had been altered, inflated to qualify for the loan amount, using a template that matched almost exactly the format used by Marsh & Kessler Title Services, a small firm in Beaver Creek. When Harold pulled the employee roster, one name matched a name I'd heard exactly once in my own kitchen in April. Derek Marsh, Sienna's cousin. He processed title work at Marsh & Kessler part-time while finishing a paralegal certificate. Renata believed, based on formatting and internal document metadata, that Derek had generated the deed template and helped structure the loan application, likely believing he was assisting with a legitimate family transfer rather than participating in fraud, though that distinction wouldn't matter much to the state once it reached that point. Renata told us Meridian Trust Bank's own fraud department had actually flagged the application independently 3 weeks before she ever got involved, after an underwriter noticed the submitted income figures didn't match the property's existing tax records on file with Montgomery County. The bank had frozen the application and sent a verification letter to the house itself, addressed to Warren, requesting a callback to confirm the request. Owen must have intercepted it from the mailbox before either of us saw it, because neither Warren nor I ever laid eyes on that letter. Renata found the bank's internal note about the unreturned verification call in the file she subpoenaed. "It was," she said, "the reason the loan had never actually funded, regardless of anything the rest of us did afterward. Owen's plan had already failed on its own before we'd even found the deed in the coupon drawer. He just hadn't told anyone that yet, and kept moving forward as though it hadn't." "This isn't a family disagreement anymore," Renata said, closing the folder. "This is something a prosecutor could care about." Detective Ray Grady got involved 2 days later, a careful, unhurried man who wrote everything down twice and asked the same question 3 different ways to see if the answer ever changed. He interviewed Warren and me separately, at the kitchen table, taking notes in a spiral pad instead of a laptop, which somehow made the whole thing feel more serious rather than less. "Walk me through April again," he said to me on his second visit. "The night your son brought the folder, word for word, as close as you can get it." I told him what I remembered. The manila folder. The pen already clicked open and held out to me. The word formality. He wrote it all down, then read it back to me exactly as I'd said it, and asked if I wanted to change anything. I didn't. It was the first time since the lockout that I felt like the details I'd been carrying around in my chest, half convinced I was overreacting to all of it, actually mattered to someone whose job it was to weigh them. Grady subpoenaed text messages between Owen and Derek Marsh going back to January through a warrant Harold helped draft, and what came back filled in the gaps Renata's paper trail had only implied. There were 41 messages across 4 months. Most of them were logistics. Owen asking how long a title search would take to clear. Derek walking him through what a quitclaim deed needed to hold up at the county recorder's office. One message sent the second week of April read simply, "Just need the folks to sign, then it's done. Don't overthink it." Grady read that one out loud to us in our kitchen evenly, without editorializing, and let the silence afterward do whatever it was going to do on its own. Warren restructured the entire family trust within 48 hours of Renata's report, locking Owen out permanently from any future ownership stake in the house or the business, with Harold personally overseeing every signature. And still, sitting in that conference room, none of us fully understood how much more there was to find, or how much of it traced back to a debt Owen had never told either of us about. Diane called me on a Sunday afternoon in late June, her voice already climbing before I'd finished saying hello. "I don't know what kind of witch hunt you and Warren think you're running," she said, "but you are about to ruin my daughter's marriage over what is clearly a misunderstanding. Owen made a mistake with some paperwork. That is not a reason to call the police on your own son." I let her finish. Then I told her the truth, calmly, because I'd had weeks by then to sit with it, and the shock had mostly burned off, leaving something steadier underneath. "It's not a misunderstanding, Diane. There's a forged loan application with both our signatures on it, neither of them real. There's a forensic accountant's report. There's an active detective. There's a closing window before the district attorney's office decides whether to pursue charges. Your nephew's name is on the paperwork trail." Silence stretched out on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Derek didn't know what he was helping with," she finally said, quieter now. "He wouldn't do something like that on purpose." "I hope that's true," I said, "for his sake. It doesn't change what's in the file." She hung up without without saying goodbye. She never called me again. 3 days before the window Harold had described to us, the window before the DA's office would formally decide whether to open a criminal case, Owen showed up at the house alone. No Sienna beside him this time, which told me something on its own. Before he'd said a single word, his shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were hollow in a way I'd never seen on my son, not even during Buckeye Comfort Supply's collapse, not even standing in that hospital recovery room in January. I asked him where Sienna was. He said she told him flatly that this was his mess to clean up alone, that she wasn't going to stand in a driveway and watch her husband explain himself to his parents like a child called to the principal's office. It was the first time I heard anything close to anger in his voice about her. A small crack I filed away without knowing yet how wide it would get by August. Mom, he said, please, I need to talk to you before this goes any further. I looked at him standing in the same driveway where I'd stood with a grocery bag and nowhere to go 7 weeks earlier. Say it, I told him. Say what you actually did. His mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. Warren stepped out onto the porch behind me, arms crossed, and Paige, our daughter, who'd driven up from Columbus the day before to be with us through the DA's decision, came out right behind him. Owen looked at all three of us standing there, and something in his shoulders gave way. I owed Rourke $85,000, he said. Rourke, I would learn later, was a private lender who'd financed part of Buckeye Comfort Supply's inventory after the bank turned Owen down for a second loan. He wasn't the kind of guy you can just stop paying. I panicked. I thought if I could get equity out of the house, fast, quietly, I could pay him off before anyone even had to know there was a problem. I told myself it wasn't really stealing, because it was going to be mine eventually anyway. I told myself I was just moving the timeline up. It was never going to be yours to move, Warren said. His voice was quiet, which was worse than shouting would have been. Not like that. Not ever like that. I know that now, Owen said. Do you? I said. Because for 4 months you didn't. You pulled a title search in January. You brought me paperwork to sign a loan while your father was out of town. You used Derek to build documents that would hold up long enough to move money before anyone noticed. That's not panic, Owen. Panic is one bad decision. This was a plan with steps. He didn't argue. That was the thing that told me he'd finally understood how it looked from the outside, that he'd finally stopped believing his own story about himself. Why didn't you just come to us? Warren asked. His voice had gone rougher than I'd heard it in weeks. $85,000. I've written checks bigger than that for equipment I didn't even need yet. You could have sat right there at that table and told me you were in trouble, because I was supposed to be past needing you to fix things, Owen said. I was 33, Dad. Marcus was running operations. Sienna's family kept asking what I was building on my own. I couldn't sit at your table again and ask for help. Not after Buckeye. Not after you had to pay off that guarantor loan because I couldn't. I told myself if I just moved fast enough, quiet enough, nobody would ever have to know there'd been a problem at all. There's always going to be a problem, Owen, Paige said quietly from the doorway behind us. It was the first thing she'd said since coming outside. That's not the part that makes you different from anyone else in this family. Everybody in this family has had a problem. The difference is what you do next. You forged our parents' names instead of picking up a phone. Owen looked at his sister like the words had cost him something to hear. He didn't answer her. I don't think he had an answer. You didn't lose this house because we didn't love you enough, I said. You lost it because you were never willing to earn anything you could just take instead. Harold's name lit up my phone in the middle of the silence that followed. I looked down at it, then back at my son's pale, waiting face, and answered it anyway, right there in front of him, because I was done managing what Owen could and couldn't hear. Vivian, Harold said, the DA's office reviewed Renata's report this morning. Given that the loan was flagged and denied before any funds moved, and given the family relationship, they're willing to let this stay a civil matter if Warren agrees not to press for criminal charges. That decision is entirely his, but I wanted you both to hear it from me before you heard it from anyone else. I relayed it to Warren, standing 3 feet from our son, and watched Owen's whole body change, relief and shame arriving on his face at exactly the same time, neither one canceling the other out. That's Dad's call, I said to Owen. Not something I can promise you. Not something you get to negotiate for right now, standing in this driveway. Owen nodded. For the first time in months, he didn't argue, didn't reframe, didn't turn the moment back around to make it about my tone instead of his actions. Okay, he said. Okay. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first honest sentence he'd said to me in a long time, and I let myself notice that, even as everything else in me stayed braced for the next thing he might try. Warren decided, in the end, not to press criminal charges. It took him 2 weeks to reach that decision, and I watched him turn it over from every angle during that time, at the kitchen table, in the truck, standing in the backyard at 11 at night when he thought I was asleep. A record follows him for the rest of his life, Warren said, the night he finally told me his answer. I keep thinking about him at 50, still paying for something he did at 33. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve consequences. I'm saying I get to decide what kind, and I'd rather he lose the house and the business and every bit of trust we ever had in him than lose the chance to ever fix any of it. I understood the reasoning. I didn't entirely agree with it, if I'm honest. Some nights I still don't. But it wasn't only my decision to make, and Warren had earned the right to make it his way after everything the past 4 months had cost him, sleep and blood pressure, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from finding out your own child built a case against you, in secret. Rourke called Warren directly in July, a number Warren didn't recognize, a voice that stayed calm in a way that somehow made it worse. He said said he understood Owen was going through some things, and that he'd appreciate the outstanding $85,000 being handled by someone in the family who could actually make good on it, since he'd heard, through channels he didn't specify, that Owen's own finances weren't looking promising anymore. Warren didn't answer him that day. He spent 2 nights weighing it with Harold before deciding what he wanted to do, whether paying it made him complicit in shielding Owen from a debt Owen had earned honestly enough, apart from everything else. In the end, Warren paid Rourke $40,000 as a negotiated settlement on the balance, not because Owen deserved the help, he told me, but because he didn't want a man like that having any remaining reason to know where his family lived. It wasn't forgiveness, it was containment. Harold structured it as a private loan from Warren to Owen on paper, with interest, with a repayment schedule Owen would spend years working through from Columbus, a debt that existed now entirely separate from the trust, from the house, from anything Owen could ever again call an inheritance. Warren wanted that distinction clear, for himself as much as for Owen. Help this time came with a bill attached. It came without any promise of what it used to promise too. The civil consequences were permanent though, and Warren made sure of that himself. The trust was restructured so that Owen received nothing, not now, not on either of our deaths, not through any mechanism Harold could think to close off. The house was retitled solely in both our names with additional protective language Harold called a no contest clause, meaning any future legal challenge to the trust would cost the challenger their inheritance entirely, a formality that existed only to make absolutely certain nobody tried this again. Hargrove Mechanical Systems terminated Owen's employment the same week the DA's office closed its review. Warren handled it himself, in his office, with Harold present as a witness, because he didn't trust himself to do it any other way, and didn't want it to happen in a way either of them could later dispute. Marcus Ibarra, the man Owen had once believed should have been him, took over Owen's remaining accounts without comment, the way a good employee does when a mess needs cleaning up and asking questions won't help anyone. He came by the house once, in July, uninvited, still in his work polo with the Hargrove Mechanical logo stitched over the pocket. He didn't stay long. He just wanted to say, he told us, standing in the doorway, that he was sorry it had come to this, and that whatever we needed covered at the company while things settled, he'd handle it without being asked twice. Warren shook his hand for a long time on the porch after that. I don't think either of them said much else. They didn't need to. None of it came cheap, in ways that had nothing to do with the house itself. Renata's forensic work ran us just under $14,000 by the time her final report was filed. Harold's hours, between the trust restructuring, the subpoena work with Grady, and the eventual civil settlement paperwork with Meridian Trust Bank, confirming no funds had ever actually dispersed, came to almost $22,000 more. Warren paid all of it without complaint, the way he'd once quietly paid off a $40,000 guarantor loan, rather than watch his son's credit collapse at 27. I noticed the difference this time, though. He wasn't protecting Owen from consequences anymore. He was protecting what was left of us from having to live inside the wreckage of what Owen had tried to build. Sienna separated from Owen in August, 4 months after the lockout, though I only learned the details secondhand through Paige, who'd stayed close enough to Sienna through the worst of it to hear her side eventually. Sienna told Paige she hadn't known the full scope of what Owen had done, not the title search in January, not the forged loan application, though she admitted she'd known about the pressure from Rourke and had encouraged Owen to figure something out without asking too closely what that meant. She filed for divorce citing financial deception. I don't know if I believe she was entirely innocent in it. I don't know if that matters much anymore either. She lost a marriage and a house project she'd already picked furniture for, and grief, even grief for something you helped build wrongly, is still grief. I ran into her once, in October, in the produce section of the Kroger on Wilmington Pike. She looked thinner than I remembered, tired around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with makeup. We stood there for a moment, both of us holding bags of apples, neither one sure what the rules were anymore for two people who used to be family, and now weren't quite anything. I didn't know about the deed, she said finally, quietly, like she'd been waiting months for the chance to say it to my face, instead of through Paige. I want you to know that. I knew he was scared about money. I didn't know how far he'd gone to fix it. I believe you didn't know the details, I said. I'm less sure you didn't know enough to ask harder questions. She didn't argue with that. She just nodded and said she hoped Warren's heart was doing better, and we went our separate ways down the aisle, and that was the last time I spoke to her. Derek Marsh lost his position at Marsh & Kessler Title Services by September. An internal review found he'd generated deed and loan templates outside his authorized scope, using the firm's letterhead and formatting without a supervising attorney's sign-off. He wasn't charged criminally, since the state's decision to treat our situation as civil closed off the clearest path toward prosecuting him too, but he lost his paralegal certification track and, from what Paige heard, moved to Cincinnati that fall to start over somewhere nobody knew the story. Diane never called me again after that Sunday in June. I heard, through the same channels everyone in a small enough town hears things eventually, that her real estate business took a hit once the story got around, the way stories do in Kettering, quietly, at church, at the grocery store, in the particular tone people use when they're being careful not to say too much, while making sure you know they've heard something. Harold walked us through the no contest language line by line one afternoon in his office, patient the way he always was, even though I suspect he'd explained it to 100 families before us. If Owen, or anyone acting on his behalf, ever formally challenged the trust in court. The challenge itself would trigger a forfeiture clause voiding any claim he might otherwise have had to anything at all, down to the smallest keepsake Warren had specifically named for him in an earlier draft, a set of his grandfather's hand tools Owen had admired as a boy. It felt cold, reading it that plainly on paper. Harold told us that was the point. Cold clauses were the only kind that held up when warmth had already failed once. Word moved through Hargrove Mechanical the way word moves through any company of 42 people who've worked alongside each other for years. Warren never made an announcement. He didn't have to. Two of the longest tenured technicians, men who'd known Owen since he was a teenager riding along on summer service calls, stopped by the house separately that August, unprompted, just to tell Warren they were glad the company was in good hands with Marcus. Neither one mentioned Owen by name. Neither one needed to. Paige became the person who held our family together through that summer, and I don't think I said thank you to her enough at the time, too busy holding myself together to notice how much she was doing it for me. She drove up from Columbus most weekends. She sat with Warren through 2 follow-up cardiology appointments I couldn't make myself attend without falling apart in the waiting room. She was the one who finally said gently, one night in July, "Mom, you're allowed to grieve him. Losing who you thought he was is still a loss, even if he's still alive." I didn't let myself do that until August, mostly. I kept moving, kept handling paperwork, kept answering Harold's calls and Renata's follow-up questions and Detective Grady's occasional check-ins as the case formally closed. There's a kind of grief you can outrun for a while if you keep your hands busy enough. Grady came by one last time in early September, mostly as a courtesy, to tell us the file was officially closed on the department's end. Civil resolution noted, no charges pending. He stood on the porch a moment longer than the news required, the way people do when they've watched a family go through something and don't quite know how to just walk away from it afterward. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've worked worse cases than this one. Families that never came back from something like this at all. You two seem like you're going to be all right." He said it plainly, without warmth exactly, but without coldness either. The way a man says something he's genuinely observed rather than something he's required to say. I thanked him. I meant it more than the moment probably called for. It caught me on a Tuesday afternoon in late August in Owen's old bedroom, which we hadn't touched much since he'd moved out at 22. I'd gone in to find a box of his old baseball trophies that Paige wanted to photograph or something, and I ended up sitting on the edge of his old bed for almost an hour, going through a shoebox of photographs I hadn't looked at in years. There was a picture of Owen at 6, missing his front teeth, holding up a fish he'd caught at his grandfather's pond, prouder of that fish than he'd ever looked of anything since. There was one of him at 11, learning to ride a bike without training wheels right there on Brookhaven Court, Warren jogging alongside him with one hand hovering near the seat, not quite touching, letting him find his own balance. There was one from his Little League championship at 12, his whole team piled on top of him, his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years by the time all of this started. I cried for a long time in that room, not for the man who'd stood in my driveway with forged paperwork, for the boy in the photographs, the one who used to believe the world would give him things because he'd earned them, before something in him decided taking was faster than earning and easier to live with than failing. I put the photographs back in the box. I closed the door to that room and didn't go back in for a long time after that. Warren had his own version of that afternoon, though he never told me about it directly. Paige mentioned it months later, almost by accident. She'd found him standing in the garage one evening in September, holding the old bicycle Owen learned to ride on Brookhaven Court, the training wheels still bolted to the back frame, rusted solid, exactly where he'd left them in a corner in 1999 and never gotten around to throwing out. He wasn't crying, Paige said. He was just standing there, turning one pedal slowly with his thumb, watching it spin. He put it back against the wall when he noticed her in the doorway and asked how her drive up from Columbus had been, and neither of them mentioned the bicycle again. I think that's the part people don't tell you about surviving something like this. It isn't one grief. It's two people carrying separate versions of the same loss, quietly, on their own schedules, trying not to make the other one's hurt any heavier than it already is. Owen moved to Columbus that fall, close enough to Paige's neighborhood that I worried, briefly, about them running into each other, though Paige assured me she'd made her own boundaries clear with him, and he'd respected them, at least so far. He found work at a smaller HVAC contractor there, entry level, the kind of job you take when your name doesn't open doors anymore, because you're the reason it stopped opening them. He called on my birthday in September. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to the message 3 times before I decided I wasn't ready to call back yet, and I still don't know, honestly, when I will be. Warren thinks I'll call him back before the year is out. He's usually right about things like that, reading people better than I give him credit for even after 41 years of watching him do it. I'm not as sure as he is. I know I'm not ready to sit across a table from Owen and pretend the last year folded up neatly into something we can simply set aside. I also know that closing the door on him completely isn't who I want to be either. Not after everything Renata and Grady and Harold helped us understand about how a person ends up somewhere that dark. Somewhere between those two things is where I've decided to live for now. It isn't peace exactly. It's closer to patience, which I've learned at 61 might be the more honest word for what people usually mean when they say they've moved on. It's February now, almost a year since Warren's stent. Almost 10 months since the day the lock beeped red and didn't know me. The house is quiet, in a way I've had to learn to like again. Warren's cardiologist says his numbers are the best best they've been in 3 years, which I credit partly to the medication and partly to the strange, terrible relief of a crisis finally having an ending, even an ending nobody wanted. We repainted the living room in October, not because Diane's fabric swatch was right, though I think about that sometimes. Standing in the new color, a warm sage green I picked out entirely on my own. We repainted because the old color had started to feel like a room other people had been planning to redecorate without me, and I wanted the walls to feel like mine again before I could stop flinching every time I walked into that room. We're hosting Christmas this year for the first time since everything happened. Paige is bringing a ham. Her husband Nate is bringing his mother's recipe for the green beans Warren has requested every December for 11 years running, and there will be one fewer place setting at the table than there used to be. I've thought about that empty chair more than I expected to, planning the seating this week, and I've decided I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter that it's there. I'm just going to set the table anyway with the number of people who are actually coming, and let that be its own kind of honesty. Paige and her husband bring the grandchildren up from Columbus most Sundays now. The same day of the week Owen and Sienna used to visit, which I don't think is an accident on Paige's part, and I've never asked her to explain it because I don't need her to. My granddaughter, Ruthie, is 4, and she started calling the house Grandma and Grandpa's Castle, which is a ridiculous, wonderful thing for a 4-year-old to say about a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street in Kettering, Ohio, and I've decided I'm going to let her keep believing it as long as she wants to. Warren still runs Hargrove Mechanical, though he's talking more seriously now about retirement, about handing the reins fully to Marcus Ibarra within the next 2 years. He told me last week that he finally feels like he's choosing who gets the business instead of just trying to survive the person who thought they already had a claim on it. I think that's the difference that mattered most to him in the end. Not the money, the choosing. Sometimes I think about Rourke, the man Owen owed $85,000 to, a man none of us ever met, whose name I only know because my son said it once, standing in a driveway unraveling. I wonder what it must feel like to be so afraid of one person's phone call that forging your own mother's signature starts to look, in the moment, like the safer option. I'm not asking that question to excuse anything. I'm asking it because understanding how a person arrives somewhere terrible doesn't require forgiving them for going there, and I've had to learn to hold both of those at once without letting either one cancel the other out. I still think about Owen more than I say out loud. I think about him at 6, at 11, at 12, that whole shoebox of a boy I raised who somehow became a man capable of sliding a blank deed under a stack of coupons and waiting for one of us to sign it without asking questions. I don't think those two versions of him cancel each other out. I think they're both true, and I think that's the hardest thing anyone ever has to learn about the people they love most. You can raise someone with everything you have and still not get to decide who they become once they're grown enough to choose for themselves. He calls sometimes now, every few weeks, careful, tentative calls that last 10 minutes and end before either of us says anything that might crack the thin piece we've built. I answer about half of them. Warren answers fewer than that. Harold tells us this is normal, that families who survive something like this don't usually rebuild all at once, that trust comes back in small increments if it comes back at all, and that we shouldn't expect ourselves to feel forgiveness on any particular schedule. He told me on our last call that he changed the locks that day because Derek had told him the house would already be technically transferable once the loan cleared, and he'd wanted to secure the asset before anyone could stop him. He used that phrase, secure the asset, about the house I brought him home to as a newborn, about the kitchen where I taught him to make his grandmother's spaghetti sauce, about the bedroom where that shoebox of photographs still sits on a shelf in the closet. He told me he was sorry. I believe that he meant it in the moment he said it. I've stopped needing to know whether meaning it in the moment is the same thing as having earned it back. Those are different questions, and I've learned to let them stay different instead of collapsing them together the way I used to. Back when I thought love was supposed to make everything simple, the house still belongs to us. It always did. No matter what my son told himself standing in this driveway on a Tuesday afternoon last spring, no matter how many documents he and a cousin I'd met exactly once tried to build a claim out of, but something else stopped belonging to us that same afternoon. Something I don't think any deed or trust or locksmith could ever restore. The version of Owen I thought I knew. The easy, uncomplicated love I used to feel calling his name up the stairs for dinner. Back before I understood that a person can grow up inside your house and still decide, one day, that everything in it is simply his for the taking. Some evenings I still stand at the kitchen window and watch the driveway the way I used to when Owen was small, waiting for headlights that meant he'd made curfew after all. I don't wait for that anymore, not really. But old habits sit in a body longer than the reasons for them do, and I've stopped being embarrassed about the ones that linger. I don't regret raising him the way I did. I regret that somewhere in the raising, I never managed to teach him the one thing that might have changed how all of this ended, that the people who love you the most are not obstacles standing between you and what you want. They're the reason you're supposed to want something better than taking it.